Welcome to Voices in Value-Based Care. I'm Beth Houck. Thanks for tuning in. The movement to value-based care is revolutionizing how healthcare providers get reimbursed for delivery of care. In this program, we're going to explore stories from the field about how real organizations are dealing with this change. You can follow the show on Twitter at #VoicesInVBC and follow me on Twitter at @BAHouck. On the program today, I talked to Tom Lee, my colleague, friend, and founder of SA Ignite. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, Beth. Great to hear you.
Well, Tom, we get to take a little trip down memory lane, so this is going to be a fun one. We realized fairly recently that this is both the 10-year anniversary of the company, but also nearly 10 years when the whole journey, this whole value-based care journey began. I think there's lots of people in healthcare that would argue that the value-based care journey has been going on for well over 10 years. But we're gonna try our retrospective by just going back that amount of time. How's that sound?
That sounds great.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that I want to start off with is by reviewing the number of programs there have been, really, I guess, since this 10-year journey started. So, we can rattle them all off and in pure healthcare fashion have them all be acronyms: PQRS, MU, CPC Plus, and the list goes on and on. Tell me a little bit about that trajectory. Tell me what you see from the trajectory 10 years ago when we started with the PQRS program and then going forward here.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a proliferation of more and more programs. Some of the, looking back, I think some of the trends have been that, you look at new programs being launched, they often do take cues from previous programs. So if we go back to PQRS and then ultimately meaningful use coming online or being passed in 2009, coming online a year or two after that, and then all the way through the introduction of value-based modifier, which really leveraged the PQRS program for measuring quality, and ultimately those programs rolling into MIPS. And so I think one of the things is it's really interesting to see how one program has really built on top of the shoulders of previous programs. And I think that's allowed providers who have really put the effort into those other programs, predecessor programs, to have a head start going into the new programs. So I think that's something that's definitely borne out in the field. Another is just the general trend towards providing not only greater financial rewards, but also transition to taking on greater downside risk. And that's very apparent in the last couple of years, and even most recently with the introduction of the Primary Cares Initiative set of programs, and also looking at how the MSSP program has now evolved in Pathways to Success, where CMS is clearly showing organizations a path towards taking on greater risk more quickly than in the past. And I think the third is really around how it's been an interesting interplay between mandatory and voluntary programs. From the get-go, we had PQRS that started out, and then ultimately becoming a mandatory program with a penalty for not reporting, and then meaningful use likewise starting out as a voluntary program, but ultimately transitioning to a mandatory program on the Medicare side, and then all the way through with the creation of CMMI, the Innovation Center with the ACA back in 2010, and the creation of what's now more than 40 different programs that have come out of that center, and seeing how there was sort of this initial move in the Obama administration towards really making a number of those programs mandatory. And then with the new administration and Tom Price heading HHS, really seeing how that started to really, the move towards mandatory really started to get pulled back towards more voluntary participation. But then now with Alex Azar's tenure, really more talk now from CMS and Seema Verma around reintroducing mandatory models. And so I think that's kind of certainly a sign of how things can change politically. But the overall trend now moving forward seems to be greater risk and more of a push towards mandatory participation.
Kind of looking back over that period of time and the kind of evolution of all of these different programs, anything about it surprise you? Is it maybe that tie to the political side of things and how that made some starts fall backwards a little bit? What sort of surprised you about this trajectory?
Yeah, I think back to the early days of meaningful use and seeing stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, and all of the predictions and the targets around having true or at least much greater interoperability by the time we got to stage 3, and that obviously did not play out. I think one thing that was really didn't get as much attention was really the business model around interoperability, and really understanding how long it would take for that to really come to fruition, as well as the technology standards being mature enough, and then ultimately putting real weight behind interoperability and mitigating situations where there may be information blocking, and really seeing that it was going to take a more heavy-handed approach, I think, as we're seeing now, from HHS with the new interoperability rules. So I think that definitely evolved much slower than everyone, including Congress, would have liked. But there does seem to be renewed momentum for that now going forward.
I think one of the trends that you and I have seen up close is the trend or evolution, if you will, of all of the different measures that have been out there, or the things that in particular providers have been measured on in order to comply with the different programs and to do well with the different programs. I think somebody asked me recently about a measure from 2013, and while in 2013 there was no way I couldn't just rattle them all off, it was a surprise to me to recall that measure existed, because it has obviously been replaced with something else. What other kinds of measure trends have you seen as we've gone through this with all these different programs? What's changed?
Yeah, it's kind of similar to the mandatory as compared to voluntary participation kind of ebb and flow. With measures, certainly we've seen the rise and proliferation of electronic clinical quality measures, the ECQMs, making its way into programs such as the CPC Plus program, certainly the MIPS program, and also the refinement of the technology behind ECQMs with the introduction of CQL, clinical quality language, to really help define those types of measures more efficiently, to be able to implement them more quickly. Then on the registry side, really seeing the massive proliferation of measures, particularly with when QCDRs were introduced, where now there's thousands of different measures, often with overlapping intents, and really CMS in recent years, recognizing that it's become very unwieldy, and really now moving towards reducing the number of measures, really trying to shift more towards outcome-based measures and stripping out more and more process-based measures. And I think the other thing that we've seen, and I think the trend will continue, is early on in the year, in the early days of PQRS, claims-based measures really played a much more prominent role. But then CMS found that there were a lot of inaccuracies and errors in that mode of quality reporting, and claims have become less favored by CMS in favor of some of these other measurement methods like ECQMs and registries. So I think that trend will continue, but I think we'll also start seeing CMS be, I think, more stringent in terms of what measures will really make the cut, given that there's already too many measures that are out there.
When you think about it, back when meaningful use was first launched and the ECQM portion of reporting for meaningful use was optional, which was a hard thing to explain to people. You're going to need to send in this data, but it doesn't matter what value you're getting on this data. To it evolving to, it does matter what value you get on this data. We've got to see up close lots of customers who've gone from having 0 in the numerator for plenty of measures to really tracking on national trends. This change in measures has really been unbelievable over the past 10 years.
Absolutely.
One of the reasons for this, obviously, what has been enabled is this incredible ambulatory EHR adoption. So meaningful use was put in place just blatantly to make sure that people got on an EHR so that data could be digitized so that we could then do something with that data and therefore use it to harness better quality and hopefully better cost and quality of care. So we looked back at some of the EHR adoption, and for really a basic EHR, less than 10% of the market was even on an EHR back in 2006. So I'm going a little past our 10-year boundary, and that's now at over 50%. On any kind of EHR, we're well over 80%. And that obviously is ambulatory EHR. The hospital EHRs have been even more, their adoption rate has been even higher. What has this enabled? I mean, I kind of queued up a few things, but what else has this enabled?
It's really game changing to have this level of penetration. I mean, in a way, it starts to remove, excuses that one can take for not trying to at least trying to participate in interoperability initiatives, particularly with now the mandatory adoption of 2015 edition EHR technology for many of these value-based care programs, and the types of programming interfaces that come with that can enable third-party applications to plug in. I mean, I think it really ups the expectation as far as really making data a lot more liquid and enabling new types of solutions to be able to be leveraged over a broader base of providers and patients. So I think that it's been really interesting to see in the last couple of years just the amount of activity there's been in even like consumer-directed applications too that ultimately rely on getting data out of the EHR. And I think that's a good development. And I think last part is that ultimately consumers will start to more and more expect to have a certain level of EHR capabilities provided by the providers, whether it be online access to their records or online appointments when we look at the practice management side. So I think that'll start to be something that consumers start to notice that difference as well.
Yeah, so on the consumer side, there's another really significant trend, which is in Medicare Advantage enrollment. So in 2009, 10 million people, 23% of Medicare beneficiaries were in a Medicare Advantage plan. And in 2018, that number is 34% of the Medicare beneficiaries are in Medicare Advantage plans. What does that mean? First off, maybe just a quick, why is Medicare Advantage different? And then what does that mean for the market to have so many more people in this type of plan?
Yeah, Medicare Advantage is really coming into a kind of a golden age now. I think that a lot of the innovations that we've been able to see from Medicare, from MA organizations, whether it's the health plan side or the provider side, early movement into addressing social determinants of health, right? Whether that be housing, whether it be even like behavioral health side, and their ability to kind of compete on those new dimensions, I think has really struck a chord with a big segment of consumers. I think the other impact of this level of growth, which is really being pulled by consumer demand, is that CMS is really recognizing that there are certain capabilities that MA provider organizations, particularly those that are under capitated arrangements with the MA plans, that these provider organizations have developed certain capabilities around how to manage a population, that can now, CMS is really looking at how can that be more broadly leveraged across the entire Medicare base. And so if you look at the Primary Cares Initiative set of 5 programs, new programs that just recently announced by CMS, the direct contracting side of that really is designed to allow a Medicare Advantage provider organization to really reach out and try to attract Medicare fee-for-service patients, and to let them also be able to be paid for using a population-based payment, and then allowing the Medicare Advantage organizations to cross-leverage a lot of their population management capabilities to the fee-for-service side as well. So I think it's this market trend towards MA is also starting to affect how CMS is really trying to now feed off of that and broaden the number of patients that benefit from those innovations.
Yeah, there's so many innovations. You hear about new ones every day. So this is going to be a one to keep our eyes on for sure. So one of the things you and I have talked about many times, we talk about with our customers, and we certainly have really led a lot of hopefully influence with our customers is what we've learned on the operational side. Like when people are operating these value-based care programs or quality departments, population health areas of the organization, there are a number of things that we've seen out in the market that have worked really well and things that maybe haven't worked quite as well. I think one of the first things I wanted to have us talk about is how much we've seen the importance of using the program as a catalyst or change agent in the organization to kind of jumpstart better behavior or jumpstart new habits. You want to talk a little bit more about that and what we mean when we talk about using it as a change agent?
Yeah, it's interesting how this pattern kind of repeats itself, with each generation of programs that's launched. I think if we look more recently at the MIPS program, for example, we've definitely seen a difference in terms of how organizations may kind of approach it more as a compliance exercise, whereas others really looked at it as a way to galvanize both awareness, kind of create more awareness as well as galvanize more support around, let's say, quality improvement, where using the MIPS framework for measuring quality as a means to really say, look, this is not only how we're going to be able to gauge quality within our organization, but this is actually a national standard where we can use to compare to others, that are out there that are similar to us. I think the other part is also seeing how, so if you look at a program like this, it definitely spans multiple areas, including cost, including the use of EHR technology, and being able to really, in a holistic way, address, for example, workflow changes or infrastructure changes that really should be made regardless of the MIPS program, but using the MIPS program as really the impetus for garnering the resources and the priority to do it across all of those different areas, quality, cost, and IT. So I think that is in contrast to organizations which may be looking at it more as, okay, let's just avoid a penalty, and then kind of with sort of like a once a year, very limited exercise to do that, and then it kind of goes by the wayside for the rest of the year. I think that as we see kind of how the last 10 years has played out, how one program has kind of inherited from previous programs, I think programs like MIPS is already being leveraged in different ways in creating new programs. So a number of the quality measures, for example, in these new the Primary Cares Initiative are really leveraging measures that were proven in the MIPS program and adopting those. So I think really looking at it as a program like that as a change agent where certain aspects of that program are going to persist even beyond into other programs, I think is a good assumption to make.
One of the things that we talked about many years ago in our trip down memory lane was putting the, I think we were specifically talking about meaningful use when we talked about it, but it certainly applies to other programs as well, is putting your program on autopilot. How can you set up the infrastructure in an organization such that it's on autopilot? Everybody knows their roles. Everybody kind of has them pretty clearly designed, and everybody knows where those handoffs are. So one of the things we coined back then was you have to make sure that your program is not a person, because a person leaves an organization, a program can stay and live on. I think you're referring to that a little bit when you're describing it as a change agent and some of the infrastructure that you put in place. But talk a little bit more about making it a program, not a person.
Yeah, it's one of these things that's very tempting when there's a program that is launched and there's a very short timeline to get it going, to apply for it, get the resources together, to really find a hero in the organization, that is proven to be able to execute on rapid, complex initiatives, and to really then put a lot of things onto that person's plate to really get the program going. And sort of one of the things that you and I have seen over the years is where some organizations, they don't make the transition towards really not only getting kind of the information from that initial person in terms of how the different things that they have to manage, and getting that spread out into other roles within the organization so it can be an ongoing effort. But also, as the program changes year over year, it becomes a cycle that could be hard to get out of, because a lot of these changes happen very quickly, and often the fastest way to keep up with those changes is just to have the same person add to their knowledge, rather than maybe taking a bit of a pause and saying, okay, how do we need to reallocate out these responsibilities, or design a set of processes or a kind of repeatable cadence of activities that don't just rely on one person. So I think it's a pattern that will continue to repeat itself the more programs that are launched. But we've seen where organizations, they've been through that, they've been able to successfully cross that chasm from kind of startup phase to regular operations, that will have an easier time absorbing the changes to come.
So one of the things I think that the EHR adoption brought as well is lots of data and information and insights into where there are gaps that need to be filled are. And if first you're being monitored on 5 measures, and pretty soon you're being monitored on 60 different measures, suddenly there's a lot on your to-do list. How do organizations figure out where to focus their resources? Or let's talk a little bit about that problem now that there's just so much information out there to tell you that lots of things are a priority.
Yeah, if everything's important, then nothing's important, basically, right. What it comes down to. It's certainly what we've seen more and more of is that there is this proliferation of measures. There isn't, measure harmonization across programs is not going to happen fast enough for organizations to really benefit significantly from that. And so what's really important is to be able to prioritize and identify, which measures, for example, are going to have the greatest impact across a number of different programs with, let's say, a single workflow redesign rather than 4 or 5 different workflow redesigns. And, one way of looking at that is certainly the financial impact, and really understanding if I have this, let's say, this immunization measure that I know is crossing 6, 7 different programs, what can I really extract that's common from what those 5 or 6 programs need, with respect to the performance of that measure, that I can raise the tide on multiple programs at the same time. So that definitely requires a certain level of analytics to get at. But I think the other factor here is not only what measure can theoretically have the greatest impact, but which measures and in what manner can you really get providers engaged and aligned and really bought into wanting to improve that measure. And so often that really comes from engaging providers very directly and involving them in the process of making these prioritization decisions. So if an organization has, a real drive towards, reducing hypertension, and that may have been there, and that's part of the DNA of the organization for a number of years before a given program, then that would certainly weigh more heavily in terms of making that a priority as well within the new programs that are coming down the pike. So a number of different factors to kind of combine there and try and decide where to focus.
So you used a magic phrase, which is what's coming down the pike. So we like to think of history as a prediction of the future sometimes. So based on everything we know, what do you expect next? What are some key trends that we should expect next?
I think a big one is just a greater focus on the entire continuum of care, for patients. A lot of activity around the social determinants of health, where now it's even going beyond, trying to integrate the acute side versus the ambulatory side, but where now health systems are really forming partnerships with community organizations that can address whether it's nutritional needs, housing, et cetera, behavioral health, physical safety, things like that. I think that the social determinants of health is just increasingly being embraced by, a lot of payers, certainly not just CMS, but also on the commercial side. I think we should expect to see a lot more activity and innovation in that area, and as well as ways of measuring how effective some of those interventions are. Another is just, continuing to see more programs, more value-based care programs being created. There's going to be more and more overlap among programs. So, for example, the MSSP program already recently been modified quite greatly by the Pathways to Success modifications. Now we have the Primary Cares Initiative where ACOs are going to be able to participate in both MSSP as well as the Primary Cares Initiative programs. So I think that, trying to navigate that and trying to manage that multiplicity of programs, I think that will also continue to grow. And then last is just looking at any individual program, just continuing to see more and more risk being shifted to providers. And so, for example, if we look at the MIPS program, it's really starting to intensify more in terms of what the upside financial impact is, but also in terms of what the downside penalty could be. And the level of competition within that one program is increasing as it is in many other programs. So I think those are kind of three things to keep an eye on as we move forward.
Well, I'm positive your list would be longer than 3 if we had more time, but we don't. I really, really enjoy always getting to collaborate with you in this format. It's fun to bring the conversations you and I have in the hallway to life in a program like this. So thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Beth. It's been fun.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. You can learn more about the show on the programs page on HealthcareNowRadio.com and lend your voice to the conversation on Twitter at #VoicesInVBC, and be sure to follow me on Twitter at Beth Houck. I'm Beth Houck, bringing you the voices in value-based care you should hear. Until next time, have a great week.